Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the Making Sense of Reforestation webinar. Today's conversation is going to focus on the topic of reforestation, specifically on seedling considerations that we hope can help you get closer to achieving your goals on your property. We're lucky enough to have a panel of reforestation advisors and from ArborGen, and they're here to discuss some innovative strategies, and they'll even share some success stories and collaborative efforts that are helping forest landowners and forestry consultants navigate options that are available to them. What we're going to do is ask that if you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button in a chat box where you can submit questions. And we'll ask that you submit those there. And our team of reforestation advisors will be happy to field them. Let me go ahead and introduce you to the reforestation advisors by their territory. We've got Kylie Burdett is with us from South Carolina. Austin Heine that covers North Carolina and Southeastern Virginia for us. There's Paul Jeffries. Paul's with us from Mississippi and covers North Alabama. We've got Mr. Greg Hay, who everybody knows over in Arkansas and North Louisiana. Shannon Stewart is with us from East Texas and South Louisiana. Unfortunately, today, Tim Gables was not able to join us. He's on assignment somewhere else, but he covers Georgia for us and Eastern Tennessee. And then Jason Cromer is also not able to join us, but he covers Florida and a little bit of Southeastern Georgia. All their contact information is available on our website at arborgen.com. So I encourage you to go there if you don't feel like you've had your questions addressed today, or maybe there wasn't time at the end. You can always go and find the contact information for the reforestation advisor that represents your territory. I think without further ado, we could actually go ahead and get started. This is going to be fun because in the past, I will say this before we get into it. In the past, we've done presentation formats. If you've ever joined us before in our previous webinars, and there's maybe like 10 or 15 minutes at the end to ask questions, and we have some dialogue, but today is going to be Q&A from the audience. And I think that's going to provide a unique opportunity for a lot of conversation, a lot of good questions that I know every time we attend a meeting, like a forest landowner meeting or a forum, wherever it is, there's so many good questions from the crowd. And I can say this after being a forester for nearly 30 years, I learned something. I feel like every week I learn something brand new from forest landowners. It's a continual education that we get as well. So we're looking forward to learning just as much from you folks today. So, Kathy, I'll let us go ahead and get into, I think we've already received some questions that have already hit. So we'll go ahead and dive into those.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, let's get started. And I know this is one you hear a lot, and it probably is one we're gonna maybe see more than once. But what's the difference between bare root and containerized? Do you get better survivability, and so that kind of makes up for better genetics, or is it better to plant containers no matter what the genetics? Aren't they all the same?
Well, I know that that's a great question that somebody posed, and I can tell you it's probably one of the most common questions we get nowadays. I know, of course, we put out an email newsletter that goes out quite frequently every couple of weeks in tree lines, and when we get asked that question, a lot of times people say, "Should I plant bare root or container?" And we always say the answer is yes. And it really just depends. And that's because it depends largely. If you look on the site, I should say, before I get too far ahead of myself, and in the time that you're planting, container seedlings are actually when they first started, when containerized seedlings first began to be planted in the southern United States back in the 1960s, the intent was for them to be planted early. The biggest, there is no difference, in the genetics. Obviously, the same genetics can be planted in either buried or container. But the big advantage is you can start planting containers oftentimes in mid-October, early November, and get a significant bump in regrowth. I will tell you, all things equal, you're planting between late November and the end of February, you're not going to see any difference in growth. So, if you're doing a really good job of site preparation on the front end, you do good supervision, which is really also the key of the planting job, then I think the literature says you should expect 87 to 90% survival, probably with buried seedlings, probably 90 to 95% with containers. All individuals have their own preferences, but I do want to say one thing. I think there is kind of a misconception sometimes that by planting containers, you get a bump in the genetics, and that is a misconception. There is no difference there. So I think a lot of it is timing. And, on the flip side of that, let's say you're forced to plant really late, like into mid-March or later in April, containers can be a good option. They extend that planting window, but it should just be thought of in a real strategic manner like that, because you're going to be investing another $50 to $60 per acre on the containers. So you really want it, like I said, I use that word strategic. You want to, if it's really worth it to you to get that bump in growth and plant early, or you think it's going to be a really tough site, like with a gravelly component, really maybe an arid type site, that could be another reason. I hope that answers a lot of the question there.
Great, Jason, thanks so much. We've got several coming in, so let me get to them as quickly as I can. So how many trees per acre? I'm hearing people that are planting 300 and 400 per acre, but what's the ideal?
Well, I bet every panelist would like to answer this question. I think I see Greg Hay smiling, so and Greg's in a pretty unique area in terms of, we say there's a southern timber market, and there is, but there's probably hundreds of micro markets that exist within, the entire southern timber market. But I'll let Greg go ahead and answer that.
I think that's the single most asked question that we get year after year after year is, what is the absolute best stocking rate and spacing that should be used? And it really is dependent on so many variables. Those variables include, what's your objective in terms of the product that you want to grow for? Is it going to be pulpwood? Is it going to be saw timber? Is it going to be pole timber? The other aspect that you need to take a look at is, what mills are you serving? If there are no mills in that area for pole timber, then you're having to truck that pole timber from your stand 200 miles. That's certainly not going to be feasible. The other aspect is that you want to take a look at just is in looking at the stocking rate and looking at the operability of the future stand. When you look at thinning it and moving forward, are you going to look at a 2-thin regime or a 1-thin regime? That's going to play a great deal of importance as to the stocking rate and the spacing. An excellent paper was written some years back by a professor out of the University of Florida. I believe his name was David South. And he addressed this question as to what is the correct planting density. And he delved into the two theories. One, plant them thick, thin them quick. Plant them thin, and you'll likely win. But there have been multiple articles published. The most recent one, I believe, was in the Journal of Forestry, and that was on loblolly pine densities. That was published just earlier this year, and it's something to look into as well. Here in Arkansas, when you have a depressed pulpwood market in the southeast that's 50 cents to $1 a ton, we found that in the last 15 years, we've really grown so much wood, and there's just not enough mills around to support that wood, that we have a wall of wood, as Dr. Pelkey likes to say, and we can't move it. With that situation in play, when I speak with consultants and forest landowners and ask them, well, you know, what's your biggest concern? I can't sell my pulpwood, Greg. What are you doing about it? Well, Greg, we can't control the market. And I asked them if they've considered perhaps changing their silviculture, moving from a 2-thin regime to a 1-thin regime, investing in advanced genetics, planting fewer trees to the acre, wider spacing. And here, if you go to a wider spacing, maybe planting that 350 to 400 trees to the acre, you're going to be able to elevate that product grade from pulpwood up to chip and saw. And just as one example, here in the southwest part of the state, pulpwood was selling for $7 a ton. A 15-year-old stand of advanced genetics delivered 24% chip and saw at age 15. They got $7 a ton for the pulpwood. They got $17 a ton for the chip and saw. Big difference. So I try to advise people to go with the widest spacing they feel comfortable with. I like 14 foot. I think it delivers greater operability when it comes to thinning that stand. You're able to thin it and do some within row thinnings as well without scarring up your trees. I'm also very much a proponent of a 1-thin regime. Again, I'm trying to elevate that product grade from pulpwood to chip and saw. I'm sure everybody's got an idea. If you ask 10 foresters what stocking rate to use, they would give you 10 different answers. I hope I've answered the question a little bit. Be glad to talk more about it and get into specifics after the webinar.
Thank you, Greg. I've got another one here too. I know most people probably on the call know about MCP, which is ArborGen's mass control pollinated. So why are people looking at MCP? Y'all have different categories, and where did it come from? Why are people starting to use it more?
Somebody like to take that?
Austin? Because I saw you get a drink of water.
Okay. So I guess the question is, why have people adopted or started planting MCP? Well, so I guess in the last 20 years, we've done surveys to track the MCP adoption, and it's steadily been growing every year. I think the most recent estimates are that it's taken up about 20% of the current seedling market. I guess going back a little bit to the basics of what is open pollinated or mass control pollinated seedlings. Open pollinated are where the female that's producing the cones, but you don't necessarily know the pollen. There's an assumption that some of that pollen's coming from within the seed orchard, and some of it's coming from outside of the seed orchard. Mass control pollinated, the benefit there is that both parents, so the female component and the male component, and those have been tested selections that have been proven in progeny tests and in the field to be superior for traits like growth and volume, rust resistance, and stem straightness. And by combining those together, you're getting an additional gain from that controlled pollination by knowing both parents. So I think that's what's been leading, or I guess driving that demand increase, is that people are seeing the results that come from combining the two parents, and the added gains that you get. I think that answers the question. But if I missed anything, let me know.
Sure. So MCP gives you faster growth and straighter trees and better disease resistant. Jason, what about faster growth and that effect on wood quality? You know, you hear a lot of times that the mills are turning some of these trees down because they don't think they're strong enough.
Yeah, that's a real common question and maybe concern. But one of the things we have to remember is that, you know, regardless of the genetics, there's really we haven't done anything to change wood quality. Now, we as an industry are probably harvesting, or we are harvesting trees at a younger age, and that's actually what dictates wood quality more than anything. You know, if you cut a loblolly pine tree, I mean, this is, you know, probably an average that you could think about. If you cut it down before the age of 20, the tree, regardless of it, if it's a first generation open pollinated tree or if it's an MCP, it's going to have about 70% of the wood that's going to be juvenile. So I can tell you that one of the things that's really important for wood quality, though, is you know, the straighter the tree, which we've made huge improvements on. That's an extremely heritable trait. Straightness is, I think, behind growth, it may be one of the most heritable traits. The straighter the tree, then you're going to have less compression wood, less tension wood. Also, we know that with MCP, which are, as Austin just described, are essentially hybrids. That's what they are. You get a lot better genetic control over things like branch diameter. You know, we have the opportunity now that a lot of these stands are being harvested for thinnings. And in many cases, like Greg said a little bit ago, they're even harvesting chip and saw off of some of these thinnings from the MCP and some varietal stands. We're seeing trees that are, you know, people say, what's the oldest tree you have, or what's the biggest tree you have? And they're 50, 60 feet, 70 feet tall, being thinned. And there's an amazing change in the branch control and the branch size. And so what does that translate to? Well, it has a huge, you know, a huge effect on the number of number one boards that you can cut out of that lumber just due to knot size. If nothing else too. So, so really the better the genetics, we see better results in terms of wood quality. Now you go cut a saw log down at age 15, it doesn't really matter what the genetics are. You're going to have some, you know, you're going to have some issues, you know, with juvenile wood, with the stem. So I think that's something clearly to remember when you're talking about wood quality and genetics.
Jason, if I may, I think you remember that Joe Dolan out of the University of Georgia did a study on the stiffness and strength of some mature stands that were intensely managed. Mm-hmm. And his results showed that, you know, he was looking at strength and stiffness properties from these mature, intensely grown stands. And he showed that the results indicated that with the study that he performed out of the University of Georgia, that the lumber quality from those mature stands, and they were from the coastal plain, have similar mechanical properties in stiffness and strength to the previous design values, and that they met or exceeded the current design values for Southern pine.
Yeah, that's right. I think that was a study that Plum Creek had helped initiate on 25-year old clear cuts. So.
And Jason, I'd like to interject here, you know, referring back to Dr. McKean's Good Wood article out of NC State, where he can be quoted from that article of basically, you know, the long misconception that highly managed stands with advanced genetics, fast-grown lumber yielded inferior wood is just simply untrue.
Thanks, guys. That's great answers there. This one actually goes across the board to all of you, but Kylie, this came from South Carolina in particular, and I know that's something that you've been dealing with, but with the recent volatility in pulpwood markets, and this said particularly in the upstate of South Carolina, Western North Carolina, what recommendation for owners and their investments when bare land value is outpacing timber markets? Do they need to replant?
Yes, definitely need to replant. If you harvest and you just let the stand grow up naturally, you're not going to be able to thin that for probably 40 years. And when you do, you're going to have really small diameters with pulpwood products. And as you know, if you're up in the upstate South Carolina area or North Carolina, the Canton, North Carolina mill just closed down. So the pulpwood market really isn't there in the upstate for hardwood or pulpwood. I know hardwood's at $0 a ton right now. Talked to a buyer the other day, and that's what I heard. So as opposed to just letting it grow up naturally, you can replant at a lower density, like what Greg was talking about earlier, with higher genetics. So you're going to get a much better product when you do your first thinning at age 15. On average, you're going to get a lot more chip and saw. And then once you do your final harvest in 25 years or so, you're going to have saw timber products. Ultimately, much better than the natural stand that you're not even going to be able to touch until the time you're actually clear cutting that stand you planted. Another really good thing about that is we were discussing this earlier, wildlife. You're going to have a much better wildlife habitat when you're planting 350 trees to the acre. So that's going to increase. And then also in that upstate area, whatever your management objectives may be for your property, if you're looking to hold on to it, that's great with wildlife and just overall aesthetics. But if you are looking to sell, I know that we've been talking with a lot of real estate agents, and a stand that has a well-managed, or a tract that has a well-managed pine stand on it, is much more profitable when you're reselling, as opposed to a stand that has a clear cut that's not very aesthetically pleasing. Those are just a few of the things, guys. Did I miss anything y'all would like to chime in on?
I'm glad you said that, because we're beginning to see, we're beginning to see like MCP in real estate transactions, like being advertised as this stand has been planted with MCP Elite or MCP Select or 2.0s. And it's really good to see the kind of the real estate world, if you will, recognize that in transactions as additional value. And so I think what Kylie said is extremely important to realize that, if it is a situation where you think that there's any chance you might be selling land or just a part of your land, you want it to be as attractive as possible. And that's probably key to think about in that regard as well, Kathy and Kylie.
Hey guys, anything else?
I was just going to chime in and say, important part there is to keep records, good records of what you plant. My favorite, I saw a landowner that had a index card book with the stickers of what he planted on his property over the years. So just keep good records.
Shannon, this one came in from Texas, and we're kind of back to the bare root container. With the drought that y'all have been having, are you seeing better survivability with container versus bare root?
I would just say that I've gotten several calls, and it's going to be across the board when we've seen these extreme conditions. You can only deal with, triple digits for so long. And so many of our guys have really been hit hard with lack of rainfall, no rainfall, even 60 days worth. So, with that in mind, I don't feel that you're going to get any additional help, regardless of what you plant in these very extreme conditions. So with that in mind, I think there are opportunities that will exist if we have the proper moisture early on, and we can get labor in place and get the seasonal rainfall that we need throughout the winter and the early spring, that you're going to get that additional root development that's provided by using containerized stock. So I wish there's better news, but at the same time, I've gotten probably a dozen calls in the last 2 weeks, and it's going to be spread across bare root and containerized stock all over Northeast Texas, all the way down into Southeast Texas, actually. So even though they they typically will receive quite a bit more rainfall, especially south of 190, it's just really taking a toll on everything. So you'll see 2 and 3 year old plantations that are having issues. You're going to have, probably 20 calls a year. People are just concerned about their big trees in the yard. They're suffering through. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but that's what is currently existing, especially, being where we are on the western edge. So with that, if we can get the trees in early, get the proper root development, and get a little break, these is 107, 108, that hurts everything.
Okay.
Shannon, that reminds me, sorry, Kathy, I'll just interject this really quick, but yeah, it seems like it was 7 or 10 years ago. I can't remember the last. There was a really bad drought in Texas, and yeah, there were even mature oaks that were dying. Yeah. So when you get something that extreme, it's tough. We have to remember that a seedling is really a plant. Yeah. And regardless of if it's a bare root or a container, in situations like this with so many days over 100 and extended time without rainfall, it's tough for bare root and container. But I will say this. I think it's good to mention this maybe right now. We've talked a little bit about bare root and container, and that's why it's always so important. If you can get the labor, ideally, if you can get finished planting by the end of February, you get into late March, and the demand for water from that seedling becomes, it's increasingly needing more water. The days are longer. Seedlings that get planted, whether or not it's container or bare root, they start to develop these far-reaching root systems, and they get, their physiology kind of gets started in place of the root systems, and they can take a lot more stress the earlier that they're planted. And so that's why we see more problems from late planted seedlings normally. Every year it seems to come up.
Jason, I would like to add in on that as well. That also really just reiterates the importance of planting depth. When you're planting seedlings, the most important thing to watch for while the planting is going on is planting depth and tightness. The deeper, if you're dealing with bare root seedlings, the deeper you plant that seedling, the closer you're getting it to available water. That as the drought starts to begin and it starts drying, soil dries from the surface down. So the deeper you get that taproot and you get those laterals, the longer the duration that those roots are going to be in a moist environment. And typically, it's not going to, with a drought, the drought depth, it's going to take a long time of continuous heat and dry conditions to get that completely dry. So planting depth is critical when there's the possibility of drought conditions. It just, the availability of that water is deeper in the ground. Just wanted to add that.
That's great.
I did want to say one thing. Paul kind of jogged my memory a little bit with the container or bare root. And if you're looking at, survival, especially in a drought, last year, South Carolina had a pretty severe drought in the low country and PD area. And I saw quite a few people who planted containers because that was their insurance policy. They weren't planted correctly, like Paul said. A lot of J-rooted containers in sandy soils, and they were only a 6-inch plug was only in the ground an inch or an inch and a half. It had no chance, as opposed to bare root on a track over that was machine planted or hand planted deep enough, they were living. So like back to what Paul said, you're planting, that's really where you need to make sure their planting depth is there to ensure survival.
Kelly, that's great because this leads into another question, and actually it has to do with planting. And how can landowners be sure that they're getting planting done the right way? What are the best things, the best preparations they can make to make sure that their trees that they've planted good money for are being planted properly?
I will take this one. The simple answer to that is supervision. You always want to be on the track if it's possible. If it's at all possible, you want to be there when the trees are going in the ground. Supervision is critical to the quality of the planting job. Sometimes planting, if you're dealing with hand planting, sometimes as the day wears on and the tree planters are become more and more tired, that sometimes the seedlings do not get as deep in the ground. They may be pulling out multiple seedlings at one time and not keeping them in the bag. Seedling storage is also very important. You do not want to leave the seedlings out to where they are in direct sunlight, even if they are in a bag, because as the bags, even though you may have winter temperatures that day, the bag setting in direct sunlight is going to be, the temperatures are going to begin to increase inside the bags or the boxes. So again, it's supervision is critical to having a quality planting job, and which is also directly correlated with survival that first year. You just cannot, there's no second for supervision. And a lot of times these tracts or the private landowner, they only get the opportunity to do a reforestation on their property once, twice, at most 3 times during their lifetime. And that's a stretch for the third one. So supervision is critical to get it right the first time.
Great.
I'd like to add that if you cannot be out there as a private landowner on the site when your tree planting is done, hire a consultant to take plots and be out there to supervise that tree planting, to make sure that the tree planters are using tools of the right length to get those trees' roots in the ground correctly, to make sure that the seedlings are stored correctly and transported and carried so that they're not carrying bunches of trees, so that they're not pruning trees at the truck. Make sure that the trees are planted correctly, and ask for a copy of that contractor's plots so that you have that documentation with you. They should be recording the temperature, the time that it starts, the time that they finished. All of that should be recorded and documented.
And also to add on to that, Greg, we provide a little pamphlet that details handling, planting instructions, and the do's and don'ts of quality planting jobs. Another thing that I have witnessed myself on planting jobs that were not supervised was you see a lot of root pruning, and that is definitely a big no-no. You do not want to allow there to be any root pruning, because we prune them ourselves before they are lifted. And that when we do that in the nursery, it allows the little cut, which is the same thing as a cut on your skin. You want to keep it covered so that you don't get any viruses or bacteria inside that. Well, the same thing happens when you cut a seedling's roots. And if you're doing it on the track, you're opening up a vector, you're opening up a pathway for something to get into that tree that can lead to mortality.
Great. Thank you, guys. This is kind of a twofer, but it had similar question. These folks say that the pines that they've been planting, loblolly, have rotational periods of 30 to 35 years. Can they plan on 17 to 20 with ArborGen with your faster growing trees? And should they change what they plant or change the spacing, since first thinnings are hard to get done? Okay, now y'all have to think.
I'll jump in, Jason, or Jason, you go ahead if you want to take. Well, I figured we could break it up into parts.
Well, I'll just mention that, yeah, there's I think one thing to remember is, of course, Greg Hay has actually had a really long career in both, genetics and site preparation. One of the things to remember is when you think about a stand that may have taken 30 to 35 years to harvest, not saying that couldn't still be common now, but remember, we do have we're doing really good site preparation these days. And so it's going to always depend on what you put into that stand, the controlling the competing vegetation, if that's, everybody has different objectives, certainly. That may not be an objective for some people, but for people that are wanting to practice intensive forestry and cut down that rotation, let's say it's even from 30 years to 25 years, you can do it. You just have to be aware that you want to control that competing vegetation. If there's any soil limitation, limiting factors. If it could even be a poorly drained site that needs to be bedded, mechanical site preparation with a Savannah plow to get those seedlings up out of the water table. So there's several things to think about. I know a lot of our literature, a lot of those newsletters we put out is remember. I think this kind of goes along with thinking or remembering you get one chance to get it right. So you want to plan well ahead of, think about everything that may go into that kind of recipe you need for success. Don't rush it, I think, is the key. Get advice from a professional forester. We're certainly here. We're not consulting foresters, but we offer a lot of reforestation advice specifically. But I think that's the thing, you got to be thinking well ahead of time and not do not get in a rush. If there's one piece of advice I could give you, is don't be in a rush and think about all the different variables that go into it. And I've probably talked too much because now I can't remember the second part of that question. may have had to do something with stocking rate. I can't remember, Kathy.
Somebody else got it. Go ahead. Go, Greg.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, I think they were talking about spacing and talking about 17 or 20 foot spacing. Is that correct?
Right. It is. Should they be planning something different or doing different spacing?
I think that that's an excellent question with regards to spacing. Spacing plays a large part in it. There's a lot of studies done on rectangularity with regards to spacing. And I know that there are some folks out here that have gone to 20-foot rows and planted within the rows, planted pretty tight within the rows. I believe in that study on rectangularity and keeping it a little bit more square. But I do believe that widening that spacing and moving from 500, 600 trees to the acre down to the mid 300s to low 400s easily, widening that spacing and going maybe from a thinning every fifth row to thinning every other row. What we're looking at is trying to make it operationally feasible for that first thinning. And if you're thinning every other row, you're going to be driving right over the top of a root mass of the row that you're taking out. And you've got the adjoining two rows root masses. So you're going to keep that heavy equipment, that cutter and those skidders above ground, even in wet situations. And by going to a wider spacing, you're going to achieve that upgrade of product from pulpwood to chip and saw at a much earlier age. And you can really reduce that rotation age from 30 to 35 down to 22 to 25 by going with advanced genetics and widening your spacing. I'm a big believer in wider spacing. Paul, I'll leave it to you.
Just back to what you said, the wider spacing, and as it comes to rotation length, I also, Greg, I think that goes back to the markets that are in your territory. In Mississippi, we have a lot of mill activity and a lot of new mills coming in. We have a new mill in Winona, Mississippi, one in Lumberton, Mississippi, and I know the procurement managers for both of those. And amazingly, their target butt diameter at those mills is 11 inches, and they want a uniform log, and we're widening our spacing. We're getting multiple benefits from that. We're improving the genetic quality of the trees that we're planting, and they're reaching an 11-inch butt well before 15, 20 years of what would typically be. Most timber was thinned for the first time at age 15. Well, we've seen varietal stands first thinned at age 8. That's an extreme situation. But we've seen MCP stands that were ready for their first thin at age 12 and 13 years old.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Exactly. And I want to bring up what Jason said earlier. Don't cheat yourself. Do the site preparation that's critical to that site, and don't cheat yourself by not doing herbaceous weed control. Herbaceous weed control is a standard operating practice now on anything that you plant. And I'll also address to Kylie. She brought up a good point on that wider spacing, the wildlife habitat benefits of that wider spacing. Back to you, Paul.
Exactly. Just all really good points, Kathy, on the question. And it's a great question. But, back to the mills, I've asked those guys, do you have a ring count limit? No, sir. Do you have a minimum age limit? No. So you're wanting a tree with an 11-inch butt, and other dimensions, a height requirement, but at the same time, if the market in your area is conducive for that, then the answer to the question is a resounding yes. You're going to see shorter rotations come out of this, and more and less time between revenue from your timber investments. You're going to shorten that amount of time between when you're going to actually benefit financially from your management investment.
And Kathy, I want to jump back in for just a second. I don't, with the risk of saying too much, and I don't want to belabor the fact too much either, but we're not advocating for people to get out here and plant like 150 to 250 trees per acre of MCP. But I think one thing that should be said here is that, and rightfully so, I mean, because a lot of people don't have the opportunities to get out and see stands develop, particularly with advanced genetic stands. I mean, we've been planting MCPs now since believe it or not, since the late 90s. With it really ramping up in kind of the late 2000s. I mean, we were probably 25 million or so being planted around 2010 or 12, now over 100 million a year. I do think it is very important, though, for this audience to recognize it. Be very careful going in at 600 or, heaven forbid, going in at 700. We still see some reluctance in people wanting to do that. And the one thing you want to remember is these advanced genetics and MCPs are really they're hybrids, just like with agriculture, hybrid corn, soybeans. But you want to be really careful at your initial stocking rate. I mean, you would be amazed. These stands do not develop the same way that we don't go by generation anymore, but there's still that vernacular that's out there, second gen, third gen. It's really just all open pollinated seedlings. But MCPs do not develop. The whole stand dynamic structure is a lot different, and you do not want to get them planted too tight to where you're forced to thin maybe sooner than you want to before they've reached a certain height. I mean, we've witnessed it. I know Kylie and I have seen a couple of stands in South Carolina planted at over 600. You got really good survival, very machine planted seedlings, and now they are really, really crowded and not achieving their optimal productive rate, because they were overcrowded from the get-go. So
I think that's the one thing, Jason.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
My apologies, Jason. That's the one thing we've learned over the last 15 years. You and Kylie have alluded to it in the stands that you witnessed, but over the last 15 to 20 years, the one thing that we've learned about advanced genetics is that you do not want to plant at conventional stocking rates.
Right.
And Jason, I would also like to add in, bringing up another or opening up another can of worms or another can of beetles, we could consider it is, the southern pine beetle is attracted to stands that are stressed. And one of the main stressors of pine stands is overcrowding and the not having enough resources available in the soil to provide the needs for so many stems per acre, thus causing stress to the stand, which could open up the avenue for a beetle attack. It's been known for a very long time that beetle susceptibility is not controlled by genetics. It is controlled by good forestry. And a good forestry requires that you maintain a healthy ecosystem. And when you overcrowd or you skew that ecosystem one way or the other, you get it out of balance. And when you get it out of balance, you're going to see bad results from that. And one of those bad results is susceptibility to southern pine beetle. And we see that, and that's also going back to the drought question that Shannon had earlier. Another way to stress a stand is with drought. So wider spacing equals healthier stands, more nutrients, more water to go around to the trees that are on the stand, and thus less susceptibility to southern pine beetle.
So speaking of pine beetles, well, not pine beetles, but titmoth. Will pine titmoth damage permanently affect tree form, and how long are they active?
So Kathy, I'll take this question. So I see in my territory of Mississippi and North Alabama, I see a lot of pine titmoth infestations across the area. And one misconception about that is that the pine titmoth is going to affect the quality of the stem or the form of the tree, and that it's going to cause a forked tree or it's going to cause a tree with multiple stems. And that's not true. The pine titmoth has been here a long time before timber management, and we were here, and it'll be here probably after we're gone. The pine titmoth usually attacks, and it lays its larva, which burrows into the apical bud of the stem, and it will cause the seedling to put on new buds that are fighting to become the apical or the dominant bud. You can have as many as 5 outbreaks per growing season, or 5 attacks throughout a growing season from life cycles of the pine titmoth. But once that pine tree reaches a ceiling height of about 12 to 15 feet, the titmoths move on, and they move on to smaller trees and shorter trees. A good way to think about this is going back to the titmoth being here a long time before we were here. You'll look around at other pine stands in the area, and you'll notice those pine trees are straight, relatively, have one stem, or not forked. And, the pine titmoths attack those just like they're attacking the new seedlings that have been planted recently. So, the pine titmoth is a nasty little bug. There's really not anything that you can do that's financially feasible to confront or combat the attacks, because it's going to wash off with the spring rains. But also it's not anything that should be very concerning, unless it is. Now, I'm not saying that it will not cause mortality, because there are extreme conditions, like going back to the drought condition, and there are ways. There's always that one out there, that one instance that it did cause mortality. But typically, the pine titmoth is going to come in. It's going to do its thing for 3 to 4 times, 5 times throughout the growing season, and it's going to move on. Once the trees get old enough and they get tall enough, they're going to be gone, and the tree will form naturally. It'll have a single stem, and again, that just drives home the importance of having that genetics in the background, make sure that it's a really good quality stem after the bugs move on.
Paul, I echo what you said, and I did just want to put in a real life experience in a stand that multiple stands in South Carolina that were hit by tip moth, 15 years ago, and an MCP stand and a varietal stand. Both landowners told me, kind of when you see tip moth on your stand, you freak out a little bit. It looks kind of scary. It can stay for a few years. And that's just this, everything that Paul just described. But these landowners were very concerned about the health of the stand. One even considered completely starting over. And, 15, 16 years later, these two stands I have in my head are two beautiful stands that are, an MCP and a varietal stand that you would never know that there was any tip moth there to begin with. So exactly what Paul said, they will grow out of it, and you'll ride down the road and see a stand that could have been hit, 15 years ago and have no idea.
I want to tag on just a little bit of information there, but we're involved with forest health co-ops as well, and there are some there may be some opportunity going forward. There's recently been a label that's come about, so just stay tuned. There may be some additional help coming in the form of a pre-application to help prevent or curve the instances where tip moth typically, if it's there, it's there. If it's not, sometimes you get a reprieve. But typically those places that are hit hard, they're always hit hard. So just stay tuned for that. Maybe we have some help coming.
Okay, here's another question, moving on to something different. With weather patterns and extreme heat and drought, how important is moving planting targets to October, November, December rather than January, February, March in order to get your root system developed before a possible drought? Here we go with planting tips.
I think that is still along the lines of using containerized material to its best advantage. And by going earlier, that's our only advantage, because in these areas like in the West, you're not going to get a significant cool down in as far as understanding historical to be able to plant anything but containerized with significant survival. If you go too early, then it's a hot plant situation with any bare root material, and you do run a risk. There are some people that have been doing it for a long time, so they're better at it. But then you also have the considerations of whether labor can show up in time to get this done for you. Not only that, but the growing facilities, can they get their labor in place to go earlier and earlier? And I guess the precursor to all of that is there enough soil moisture to even consider doing it that early, and we just don't know. So I guess over and all, y'all help me out, but the crystal ball, it tells lies sometimes. So it's hard to hang your hat on any particular situation, because you may or may not get rain. Thank goodness we did get the rainfall we did in the early spring here. Otherwise, it would be a catastrophe, just based on what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So anyway, that's my 2 cents there.
Okay. So how early should people order seedlings before they're planting? And I'll tack on to that another question, which is, and how do I know that I'm getting a good quality seedling from you folks? Okay.
Can you say the first part of the question one more time? How do you know you're getting a quality seedling? But what was the first part of the question, Kathy? I'm sorry.
How early should they order seedlings before planting?
Right. I'm sorry. Well, I think as soon as you we definitely see fluctuations in demand, from year to year. Sometimes seedlings can be scarce by, going into April or in May and June. Other years there may be better availability, but you just don't ever really know. So it's always better to go ahead and I'm not just going to make this just about seedlings. I think it's good to we've talked about this, the incorporation of the whole regime. I think it's best to contact your site prep contractor, the person that's going to plant your trees, and then also to book your seedlings. I think it's good to do all those things is early. I mean, most of the providers in all of those services have a period of like an allowance period of if something goes wrong and you can't go through with the project, and there's a somewhat of a grace period. So I think that tells you that as soon as you know what you're going to do, and you know that you're going to do all those projects, that reforestation project, I should say, and I think it's best to move forward with that as soon as you can. As far as how do you know you're getting quality seedlings, I know that one thing that ArborGen did years and years ago that is pretty unique it is unique to the forest industry, is we established our own internal third-party review of seedling quality, if you will. And so what I mean by that is, all nurseries take inventory. They take morphological measurements of the seedlings in terms of, taking root collar diameter measurements during the course of the growing season in the nursery beds or in the containers. They take heights. We culture the seedlings in terms of we do top pruning to make sure that the seedlings all grow uniformly and develop in a very uniform fashion. With bare root seedlings, we undercut them so we can keep the root systems in control. It also helps the seedling actually initiate dormancy as you roll into the fall. But in tandem with our nurseries that are managing and taking measurements to understand where the crop is, our product development group, which is, you can also think about our product is seedlings, obviously, but genetics also. But our product development group is our group that is focused on tree improvement and genetic development, genetic resources. Well, they're also our in-house third-party review of seedling quality. And so beginning in July, they're taking measurements, and we can know for, any given family in our lineup, in our commercial lineup that year, the trajectory that family is on, and where it should be in terms of when it's delivered to the customer. So the customer can then know that it's not only being placed under a lot of scrutiny from the nursery, but also being looked at separately by it's kind of like a checks and balances system, if you will, inside the company. And it's something that we found works really well to kind of keep us all, supporting each other and making sure that the seedling that goes out the door to the client, to the land, to the property owner, I should say, is a good quality seedling.
Thank you, Jason. We're getting close to the end of our time here. So I'm going to, Austin, I'm going to hit you up with, with the timber markets being sort of iffy and not getting great prices for timber right now. How do I justify paying for more for better genetics?
So how do we justify paying more for better genetics with the timber markets the way they are now? Basically the way I look at it is wanting to set your property up or your stand up for success in the future. I think that we talked about a crystal ball a little bit on here, but it's kind of hard to predict what things are going to be like 25 years out, what the market will be like. But I think planting the best genetics that you can to get your property set up on a good foot and a good start. Most of our products are geared towards saw timber potential. So you're planting the best genetics to to get your stand established for saw timber with stem straightness, reduced forking, and added volume growth. I think that's gonna get you set up. But I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
Well, Kathy, I kind of can't help myself here. I'm sorry. I want to jump in and just kind of dovetail on what Austin's saying is, I know our old mentor, John Pate, used to always have a great example that he would show that we call it, the famous corn slide. And, if you think about, let's face it, a lot of timber owners are also they're farmers, they're cattle farmers. They're also row crop farmers. I mean, we have several people that grow cotton and they grow trees or soybeans and corn and trees, forest farmers also. And if you stop and think about it, this is kind of amazing. And here's a good correlation for you. Corn, I think it may have changed very recently, but the price of corn was about $2.50 a bushel, $2.50 a bushel in the mid 90s. Well, it's still about the same price right now, but the way the farmers have stayed in business is by increasing their yields going through the roof. So if you listen to rural radio, where they do a really good job of talking about improved performance of hybrid, corn or soybeans, dogs, as you hear in the background, it's all about yield. And so anyway, that's a good correlation I think that people can remember, is that for the same land, you want to be more productive. If you can't change the price of the products, which none of us can control, what you can change is the productivity, the yield that's coming off of those same acres. I think that's a good way to think about it.
All right. Well, I think we're actually at our time limit here. What I wanted to do is thank everybody that's on, and Jason, you, if John Pate or friends are online and you called him our old mentor, I'm going to call him our wise mentor, and then you deal with old after that. So folks, we still had a lot of questions that we could get to. If you've provided us with your email, I'll try to get some of these distributed to the RAs, and they can get in touch with you and answer your questions. Also, I'll remind you, all their contact information is on our website. If you go to the bottom of the page, there's a Reforestation Advisors link that you can go in, and that would include the two that were not with us today. We thank you very, very much for joining us. We're hoping to do this again soon, and take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.